The billionaire returned to his abandoned childhood home to destroy it. But what he found changed everything. The Bentley was too shiny for the dusty road. George Walker hadn't planned on taking it. It was Margaret's favorite, though, and maybe that was the point. The leather still held the faintest trace of her perfume, lavender and something older, something softer. The car wound through the narrow back roads of Millersfield, the town no one remembered, not even the GPS. That was fine. George wasn't trying to be found. The sun was setting by the time the tires crunched onto the gravel path leading to the house. His house, or it used to be. The chimney was crumbling, the white paint flaked off like dried skin, and the porch sagged under its own weight. It looked smaller than he remembered, as if time had shrunk it. Or maybe he had just grown too large, too heavy with the years, with money, with memories. He stepped out, adjusting the collar of the worn grey coat he'd bought at a thrift store 2 towns back. No one could recognize him like this. No tailored suits, no polished shoes, just George Walker, an old man carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a plan he didn't want to speak aloud. The plan was simple: return to the place where he had once been happy. The place before money, before private jets and business meetings, before Margaret got sick, before she left. He stepped onto the porch, each board creaking like it remembered him. The front door was slightly ajar. He froze. A flicker of movement, then a shadow darted past the window. Someone was inside. George's first instinct was to retreat, to turn around and walk away, but something kept him there, a strange pull. Slowly, he pushed the door open and stepped into the house that had held his childhood dreams. The air was thick with dust and something else. Life. A faint scent of canned beans, burning wood and old clothes. The living room had been rearranged barely, with blankets spread over the floor like a nest. A small fire burned weakly in the old fireplace. Then he saw them. 3 children, frozen, eyes wide. A girl, maybe 13, stood in front of the others like a shield. Her clothes were torn, but her posture was proud. Behind her, a boy of about 10 clenched his fists, and beside them, the smallest, a little girl with tangled blonde hair and dirt-smudged cheeks, clutched a stuffed rabbit by the ear. "Please don't call anyone," the older girl said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We're not hurting anything. We'll leave if we have to." George stared at them, words failing him. His mouth opened, then closed. The girl stepped forward. "We didn't steal anything. We just needed a place to stay. It's cold at night." George swallowed. This is my house." All 3 flinched. "But I haven't been here in 60 years, he added quickly, as if that would soften it. The boy squinted. "You lived here?" "A long time ago," George said, his voice softer now. "What are your names?" They hesitated. The girl finally said, "I'm Emily, that's Jack, and the little one is Lily." Lily didn't speak, but hugged the rabbit tighter. George looked at them, really looked. Their faces were too thin, their clothes layered and patched. Not squatters, survivors. "You're not from around here," he said. Emily shook her head. "No." He wanted to ask more, why they were here, what they were running from, but something in their eyes told him not to. Not yet. "We didn't think anyone would come back," Jack said, his voice a mix of challenge and fear. "No one ever does." George set down his bag slowly. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just needed to see this place again. I'll leave in the morning." There was a pause, like everyone was waiting for the other to speak first. Finally, Emily nodded. "You can stay. Just one night." "Deal," George said. That night, he slept in the old guest room. The mattress was gone, replaced by folded blankets on the floor. The window didn't close all the way. The wind whispered through the cracks. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling every ache in his body. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anything, really. The pills were still in the bag. His farewell letter, addressed to no one in particular, was still folded in his coat pocket. But now there were children in the house. He didn't sleep. At some point past midnight, George stood and wandered into what used to be his bedroom. The wallpaper had peeled away, revealing scribbles on the plaster underneath. He recognized his own teenage handwriting. George was here. Dream big. Margaret plus G. He smiled, a sad, crumpled thing. He reached behind the loose panel near the window. He remembered hiding things there as a kid. To his surprise, something was still tucked inside. A note, folded paper, yellowed. He unfolded it with shaking hands. If I ever come back here, I hope I'm still me. Not rich, not angry, not broken, just me, just George. Age 17. His chest tightened. He didn't remember writing it, but he knew he had. He could see the version of himself who had scribbled it out, skinny, full of fire, full of dreams. That boy had no idea about billion-dollar mergers or cancer diagnoses, or being alone in the biggest house in the city. That boy would have hated the man George had become. The floor creaked behind him. He turned to see Emily, standing in the doorway. "I heard something," she whispered. "Are you okay?" George hesitated, then nodded. "Just remembering." She looked at the note in his hand, but didn't ask. Instead, she said, "You can stay longer if you want." He blinked. "I thought you said one night," she shrugged. "I changed my mind." George chuckled, the sound strange in his throat. "Well, thank you." She lingered a moment longer, then turned and padded back down the hall. George stayed in the room a while longer, the note still in his hand. The past had reached out to him in the quiet, and for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like something had begun. The morning came quietly, as if the sun was unsure it should rise on a house that had seen so much forgotten sorrow. George stirred to the sound of soft footsteps and the faint clatter of pans in the kitchen. He hadn't slept much. The floor was hard, the air cold, but it wasn't discomfort that kept him awake. It was the children, 3 strangers who had crept unexpectedly into the final chapter of his life. He sat up slowly, his bones protesting. The faded blanket they'd given him was thin but warm, and the scent of something frying, eggs maybe, filtered under the door. In the kitchen, Emily was at the stove. Jack sat at the table, carving a piece of wood with a dull butter knife. Lily hummed softly to herself as she drew on a scrap of cardboard with a crayon that had been worn down to a nub. George hesitated in the doorway. Emily noticed him first. "Morning." Jack didn't look up. Lily waved. "I didn't expect breakfast," George said. Emily shrugged, flipping something in the pan. "We found eggs behind the Jenkins barn a few days ago. They've got chickens that wander." George frowned. "You stole them?" "We borrowed them," Jack muttered. "They've got plenty. No one's starving over there." George said nothing. He'd once bought a French vineyard just because Margaret liked their rosé. The idea of scrounging eggs from a neighbour's wandering chickens felt like a story from another world. Still, he sat. Emily slid a cracked plate in front of him, 2 slightly burned eggs and half a slice of bread. George hadn't eaten anything this humble in decades. It was the best thing he'd tasted in months. As they ate, George tried to study them without making it obvious. Emily was cautious, always watching Lily, always listening to Jack. She held herself like someone who didn't expect help and didn't have time to hope for it. Jack was fidgety, clever-eyed, constantly testing George with glances. Lily was the only one who seemed untouched by fear. "You're not like other old people," Lily said suddenly, wiping crumbs from her chin. George raised an eyebrow. "No, you don't talk so much. Most grown-ups talk too much." Jack snorted. "You just like him because he didn't make you take a bath." Lily stuck out her tongue. Emily gave them both a look and said to George, "So, where are you from?" George took a sip of the instant coffee Emily had managed to make. It was bitter and thin, but warm. "Around," he said. "I lived here once. Long time ago." "You live here now?" Jack asked, eyes narrowing. "No, not really." Jack pushed his plate away. "Are you going to call someone? Tell them about us?" George met his gaze. "No." The boy didn't blink. "You sure?" "I'm sure," George said gently. The tension in the room softened a notch. After breakfast, George wandered the property. The backyard was overgrown but familiar. The old swing set was long gone, and the shed he and his father had built had collapsed inward like a broken rib cage. He found a rusted wheelbarrow near the tree line and tipped it upright, just to see if he still could. Later, Jack joined him. "You really used to live here?" George nodded. "Before your time, before a lot of things." Jack studied him for a while. "You don't talk like you're poor." George chuckled. "What does a poor person sound like?" "Not like you." George crouched beside a patch of stubborn weeds, yanked a few up by the roots. "Well, maybe I'm just lost." Jack didn't respond, but he didn't walk away either. That night, after Emily and Lily had fallen asleep, George sat by the fireplace. The flames danced low, throwing flickering shadows against the walls. He stared into the fire and thought of Margaret. How many nights had he sat in silence, in a house too large for echoes, thinking about her? Her laugh, her touch, the way she always knew when he was pretending to be okay. Her absence was louder than any room he'd ever stepped into. He reached into his coat and pulled out the letter. It was still folded neatly, still unsigned. He didn't open it. Instead, he stood and wandered again, this time into what used to be the old dining room. The floor creaked differently here. He crouched down near the wall, pressing on one of the loose boards. It popped free. Inside the small hollow space beneath, he found dust, spiderwebs, and something else, a photograph. It was torn across one edge and faded, but still legible. A group of children standing in front of the house, 4 boys and a girl. One of them was George, maybe 8 or 9. The girl, he stared at her, something about her eyes. And the smallest boy standing beside her, his face felt oddly familiar. He turned the photo over. Faint pencil marks, just a name. The Jenkins kids, summer 55. George's brow furrowed. He remembered the Jenkins family. Barely. They lived just past the hill, had 5 kids, always barefoot. Poorer than most even back then. The girl in the photo had looked after the others, even as a child, just like Emily. He stared at the photo for a long time. The past was still here, just buried under dust and silence. Over the next 2 days, George found himself falling into a rhythm he hadn't expected. Emily showed him how to light the fire properly without wasting matches. Jack taught him how to find edible plants growing wild near the fence line. Lily made up songs about squirrels and sang them without shame. In turn, George shared quiet wisdom, fixed a leaking pipe under the sink, and told them bedtime stories that weren't too sad. He never asked too many questions. He could feel their trust growing, slow, fragile, like a plant in winter light. But inside, he was unraveling. His plan had been so clean, quiet, no drama. He wasn't afraid of death. He was afraid of dragging his grief out any longer. But every laugh from Lily, every sarcastic jab from Jack, every firm decision from Emily chipped away at the armor he'd built. They didn't know they were saving him. And that somehow made it worse. Or maybe better. On the 4th morning, George stood outside and stared at the woods beyond the house. The photo from the floorboard was in his pocket. He hadn't told the children about it. Not yet. He wasn't ready. The fire inside him, one he thought had gone out, was flickering again. The clipping fell out by accident. George had been cleaning the small table near the window, brushing away crumbs and dust with the sleeve of his coat, when the folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages of an old almanac Emily used to press leaves. It fluttered to the floor, like something that didn't want to be found. He bent down slowly, knees aching, and picked it up. The headline was bold. Too bold. State investigates multiple abuse claims at Ridgeway Children's Home. George's breath caught. He read standing up, then again sitting down. The article was old, 6 months maybe, but the words were sharp and unkind. Neglect, forced labor, unreported injuries. A facility meant to protect children had instead broken them quietly, behind locked doors and paperwork. He didn't need to read the name twice, Ridgeway Children's Home. His fingers tightened around the paper. Behind him, the floor creaked. George turned. Emily stood in the doorway, her face pale. Jack was just behind her, eyes already burning with anger. Lily peeked out from behind Jack's leg, clutching her rabbit. Silence stretched thin. "Where did you get that?" Emily asked. George swallowed. "It was in the book. I wasn't—" "That's where we came from," Jack snapped. "That place." Lily's grip tightened. George folded the paper carefully and set it on the table, as if it were something fragile. "I didn't know, I swear." Emily stared at him, jaw clenched, eyes shining with something that wasn't tears, but might become them. "We didn't want you to know." "I'm glad I do," George said quietly. Jack took a step forward. "They hit us." Emily flinched but didn't stop him. "They made us scrub floors until our hands bled," Jack continued. "They locked Lily in a closet once because she cried at night." Lily nodded, as if confirming a fact, not reliving a nightmare. George felt something twist violently in his chest. Rage, shame, guilt for every donation he'd ever made without looking closely, for every board meeting he'd skipped, for every time he'd assumed money fixed things. Emily exhaled shakily. "I told them we were leaving." Mr. Bradley laughed, said we wouldn't make it a week. George recognized the name immediately from the article. Mr. Bradley. "I stole the keys," Emily said. "We ran at night. Jack carried Lily most of the way." Jack shrugged. She fell asleep. George closed his eyes. "I won't tell anyone," he said firmly. "Not unless you want me to, I promise." Emily studied him, searching for something. Truth, maybe. Finally, she nodded. That night, George didn't touch the letter in his coat. He didn't think about the pills. He sat awake, listening to the wind and thinking about children who had learned too early how cruel adults could be. 2 days later, the town stirred. George noticed it first at the general store. Whispers. A truck he didn't recognize parked near the post office. A man asking questions too politely. He saw him from across the street. Tall, clean-cut, expensive shoes made to look ordinary. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Bradley. George's pulse quickened. That evening, the man came walking down the gravel road toward the house. George stepped onto the porch before he could knock. "Can I help you?" George asked. Mr. Bradley smiled. "Evening. I'm looking for 3 children. They might have wandered this way." George leaned on the railing, forcing calm into his voice. "Plenty of kids wander through here. This is the edge of nowhere." Mr. Bradley's eyes flicked past George, scanning the house. "They ran away from a facility I manage. I'm just trying to bring them home." George held his gaze. "Funny, because home doesn't usually leave bruises." The smile thinned. "I don't know what you think you know, old man," Bradley said softly, "but those kids belong under my care." "They belong safe," George replied. Bradley's eyes hardened. "If you see them, you'll let me know." "I won't." A pause. Bradley chuckled. "You're braver than you look." He turned and walked away. George didn't move until the sound of footsteps faded. Inside, the children were silent. Jack spoke first. "That was him." Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "He found us." George nodded. "Yes, But he doesn't have you. Yet. That night, George did something he hadn't done in years. He made a call. The contact answered on the second ring. "George Walker," the man said, surprised. "Didn't expect to hear from you." "I need a favor," George replied. "Off the books." There was a pause. "That sounds like the old days." George stared out the window at the dark road. "There's a man named Bradley. Runs a place called Ridgeway Children's Home. I need everything. Now, I'll make some calls," the man said. "You sure you want to step back into this world?" George glanced toward the hallway where 3 children slept, unaware of the machinery about to move around them. Yes. By morning, things changed. A black sedan rolled into town, then another. People started recognizing George, not as the quiet old man in a thrift store coat, but as something else, someone else. The whispers grew louder. The children noticed. Jack watched George carefully now. "Who was on the phone?" "A friend," George said. "What kind of friend?" "The kind with resources." Emily folded her arms. "You said you were just a traveler." George hesitated. "I didn't lie," he said. "I just didn't tell you everything." That afternoon, a reporter showed up in town. Then a state vehicle. The house at the end of the road was no longer invisible. That night, George sat alone on the porch, the letter in his hand. For the first time, he unfolded it. He read it slowly. Then carefully, he tore it in half. The dust of the past was being stirred, and this time George Walker wasn't running from it. He was choosing to stay. The sirens came just after sunrise. They cut through the quiet like a blade, sharp and unmistakable, winding their way down the gravel road toward the house at the end of it. George was already awake. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug, staring at nothing in particular when Emily burst into the room. "They're here," she said, her voice shaking. "It's him and the police." Jack was right behind her, pale but defiant. Lily clung to Emily's sleeve, eyes wide, breath coming in short, frightened gasps. George stood. From the porch, he could see them clearly now. 2 police cruisers, a black sedan, and Mr. Bradley stepping out with the same practiced smile, the same expensive shoes pretending to be ordinary. This time he wasn't alone. George felt the old instinct rise, the one that had ruled his life for decades. Control the situation, manage the narrative, use power quietly. He took a breath and stepped forward, placing himself between the house and the road. The officers approached first. "Sir," one of them said, hand resting near his belt, "we've received reports of runaway children being harbored here." George nodded calmly. "You have." Mr. Bradley stepped up beside them. "I've been trying to recover them for weeks," he said smoothly. "I appreciate your cooperation." Emily whimpered behind George. "No," George said. "You've been trying to silence them." Bradley's smile tightened. "Careful, old man." George straightened, his back aching but unbowed. "My name is George Walker." The name landed like a dropped plate. One of the officers blinked. "As in?" "Yes," George said. "That George Walker." The air shifted. Phones came out. A whisper moved through the small gathering like a ripple. Bradley's confidence cracked, just slightly. "That doesn't change anything." "It changes everything," George replied. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. Thick, heavy, evidence, photographs, medical reports, recorded statements, financial records that traced abuse back to neglect, and neglect back to greed. "My investigators uncovered this within 48 hours, George said evenly. "Child labor, assault, fraud, and obstruction, all signed by you." Bradley lunged forward. "Those kids are liars." "They're survivors," George said, "and you're finished." The officers took the folder. Radios crackled. One of them turned to Bradley. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us." Bradley's face twisted, the mask finally gone. "You think this ends here?" he hissed at George. "You think money makes you a hero?" George met his gaze. "No, love does." Bradley was led away, shouting, struggling, his voice fading down the road that had once led only to silence. The police stayed a while longer, asking questions, making calls. Reporters arrived, cameras flashed. Through it all, the children stayed inside, watching from the hallway, holding one another like a single fragile thing. When it was over, when the road was quiet again, Emily finally spoke. "So," she said softly, "you're rich." George nodded. Jack crossed his arms. "You're going to send us away now, aren't you?" The words hit harder than any accusation. "No," George said immediately. "I'm not." "That's what they all say," Jack muttered. Emily looked down. "You don't need us anymore." George felt something break open in his chest. He sat down, right there on the porch steps, lowering himself to their level. "I need you more than you know." They stared at him. "I came here because I was done," he continued, his voice trembling despite his effort to steady it. "I didn't see a future for myself. I came here to say goodbye." Lily frowned. "Goodbye to who?" "To life," George said. Silence fell, heavy and stunned. Emily's eyes filled. "You were going to die?" "Yes." Jack's voice cracked. "But you didn't." George smiled sadly. "Because of you." He looked at each of them in turn. "You fed me. You trusted me. You let me stay. Without knowing it, you saved my life." Tears slipped down Emily's cheeks. Lily climbed into George's lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You can't leave," she whispered. "I won't," George said, holding her gently. "I promise." The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, interviews and quiet changes. The orphanage was shut down. Charges were filed. Other children were removed and placed safely. The town watched as the old house at the end of the road was repaired, not into something grand, but into something warm. George moved in fully. No more pretending. One afternoon he gathered the children in the living room. "I have something to ask you," he said. Emily straightened. Jack tensed. Lily smiled, sensing something good. "I would like to be your legal guardian," George said, "if you'll have me, permanently." Emily covered her mouth. Jack stared at the floor. Lily squealed and threw her arms in the air. "Yes," Emily said through tears. "Yes." The judge signed the papers a month later. The house filled with laughter. Shoes by the door. Drawings on the fridge. The past no longer whispered. It listened. George Walker, who once had everything and nothing, sat at the dinner table one evening, surrounded by a family he chose. And for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like an ending. It felt like home.